Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Jack Chalman. I'm Chief Project Officer at the Global Returns Project. I will start very quickly with a few thank yous. First, to the Leather Sellers for this incredible venue this afternoon. We are hugely grateful. To all of you for making time to be here with us. To our incredible speakers, including, of course, the Right Honorable Rory Stewart OBE, who we will be hearing from in a moment. And finally, to the amazing team at the Global Returns Project, especially Georgie Murrin, who has planned this event for months, and Kiki Shigita as well. Today, we're going to hear about the state of our planet and what we can do to make a difference. Not just listening, hopefully, but thinking about action as well. How we can pledge support for some of today's best climate solutions. More on that in just a moment. Let me start with a very quick introduction to the Global Returns Project, or GRP. As many of you know, GRP is a UK charity that cultivates and curates a diverse portfolio of some of the best climate and nature charities in the world. Our job is to get as much funding as possible to these remarkable organizations and to select and reassess them regularly. We do all that without charging any fees. Our work, 100% of every donation made to the Global Returns Project is distributed to the charities in our portfolio with no fees or deductions. How do we work? Well, we've got an amazing team of experts who've helped us look at thousands of charities all around the world, finding the fastest paths to global impact for all the planet's biggest problems, from rainforests to oceans to regenerative agriculture and more. Every 6 months, we reassess our charities, and every 6 months, every donor gets an impact report. Today, we'll hear from 2 of our wonderful charities, and we'll be thinking about support for all 6 of them. One last very quick thought. These days, so many of us read the news and we feel worried, right, about pollution or plastics or extinctions around the world, or what feels like global indifference to those issues. And you ask yourself whether you can matter for these things, whether you can matter. With the Global Returns Project, the answer to that all-important question is simple. You can. With the Global Returns Project, you can. Thank you again for being with us. Let me turn things over to the chair of the Global Returns Project, Joe Bacon.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon. Today, the Right Honourable Rory Stewart, my very kind and generous cousin, has made time in his unbelievably busy schedule. Without too much older cousin pressure, I think. He may say differently, but anyway. He's also going to tell us about his experience as the Minister for Environment and how politics affects climate action. We are so very grateful for his time. Rory and all our speakers are here to encourage every one of us to pledge our support for the Global Returns Project's portfolio of charities. This year, GRP is doing everything we can to raise £1 million before the 31st of March 2026. We will distribute every pound of that money to our current 6 charities. That is the Blue Marine Foundation, ClientEarth, Global Canopy, Rainforest Trust, Trillion Trees, and the regenerative agricultural work of the Rainforest Alliance. I'd like everyone to open the leaflet that was on your seats. And this is the beginning of my origami lesson. But on the inside, there's a little insert. And if you could look at the back of that, it'll make sense of what I'm saying. Right. Too much of sustainability can feel like guesswork. Hoping that the planet benefits from our electric car or the flight that we didn't take, something like that. But this campaign isn't like that. Our charities know what they will achieve with £1 million. And you can see it right there on your leaflet. Through Global Returns Project, they will protect 112,000 acres of rainforest, restore 50,000 trees, expand marine protection in areas like Scotland and Greece, fund an entire lawsuit fighting European bottom trawling, help publish deforestation data on 2,000 companies, and transform cocoa farms in Indonesia to regenerative agriculture. We will make a difference. Donating will make a difference. So let me explain quickly how you can. I'd like everyone next to me to unfold the little card that was inside that little pack, and we're asking everyone here to fill out the pledge card before the end of the afternoon. And then, potentially, we'll give you some more to take home, because I'm sure you'll know some other people who would like to join in this venture. Today's event is a major milestone in our fundraising campaign, and we won't be able to reach our global goal without your support today. On behalf of our charities, our planet, and our collective future, we ask that you think big and pledge your generous support to get us to our goal. So please pledge generously. That's the theme of today. And thank you very much. Now, without further ado, let me formally introduce the Right Honourable Rory Stewart. He is currently the Brady Johnson Professor of the Practice Grand Strategy. It's a great title, Rory. At Yale University. But this is only part of his quite mind-blowing career. He has so far been a Member of Parliament for Penrith and the Border, the UK Secretary of State for International Development, Minister of State for Justice, Minister of State in the Foreign Office and DFID, Minister for the Environment, and Chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. But in between all of that, he's authored a number of international best-selling books, including The Places in Between and Politics on the Edge, a memoir from within. But also, just in case you haven't got enough to do, I expect you all know that he now co-presents the UK's top podcast, The Rest is Politics, with Alistair Campbell. Rory, again, we are very honoured to have you with us this afternoon, and also for your support of the Global Returns Project. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm very proud today to have my cousin here. In fact, I have three of my cousins here, which is a great gathering. I think largely I'm here to say thank you to all of you who are supporting, who are working in this field, and who are interested in supporting. And we are at a moment where government basically around the world is in a muddle. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means and how that muddle unpicks. But essentially, you can see it in Britain. There's an enormous sense of paralysis and disappointment and a sense of broken systems. And that is where Global Returns is very powerful and very helpful, because the 6 organizations with which they're working are unbelievably well-focused and effective organizations that really know how to achieve change. And they're exactly what you want if you're going in to see a Minister of the Environment, because they are the people who can show the unfortunate Minister exactly how the bottom trawling fishing is happening in the marine protected area. Or I remember as Minister of Environment, in fact, facing ClientEarth while we were doing our best to kill you all with air pollution in London. And the sense of the civil servants reeling from the legal attack and having to rethink almost everything that we're doing. So they're blue chip organizations. They're organizations that you can trust, which is important in the world, but they're also extremely effective. Now, bigger space. The biggest space, I want you to think about the world since 1989 in 4 main dimensions: politics, economics, international relations, and media technology. And the story that I'm about to tell is essentially a story about why climate and the environment is now at a particularly acute moment of crisis, why your work is more important now perhaps than it has been at any previous point. Now, you will hear from the other speakers today why that is the case in relation to particular indicators in the natural environment or in the atmosphere. But this is also fundamentally true in terms of the political and economic structures. Because in the end, almost everything that you're talking about depends on legislation, governments, and money. In the end, it is almost impossible to do any of the things that we want to do in nature, conservation, or in tackling climate change unless we are engaging with those things. And particularly unless we're engaging with those things internationally. I mean, I don't need to tell anyone in this room, it doesn't really matter where the carbon's going into the atmosphere. And if you ended up with a system in which 2 or 3 countries were behaving very well, but 197 were not, it would make absolutely no difference to the way the world was going. So the crisis that I'm about to describe to you is a crisis which strikes at the heart of what you're trying to do and which provides the terrain in which global returns is operating. And I hope it will explain to you, just setting up my colleagues before they speak, why their work is particularly urgent at the moment. So here we go. 1989 to 2004. 1989 to 2004 was a period where the world seemed remarkably stable. The number of democracies in the world doubled during that period. This was a moment where everybody comfortably was getting behind the idea of markets, globalization, free trade. It was the period when the European single market was created, when Mexico and Canada joined the United States in NAFTA, when China joined the World Trade Organization. It was a great moment for the international rules-based order. This was the moment when a lot of the international climate cooperation was beginning to get off the ground. It's a moment where those of you in the audience who are bankers, this is Basel I and Basel II. These are attempts to set up, this is when the International Criminal Court was set up. This is where we were going to make poverty history. This was the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. It was a period where for every year, things seemed to be going in a progressive direction. Every single year during this period, there are more democracies, there are more infants surviving, adult life expectancy is increasing, global poverty is decreasing, civilians killed in conflict is going down, refugees are going down, internally displaced people are going down, and in the United Kingdom, GDP per capita is growing faster than the United States for the first time since 1870. Right? This is an extraordinary time, in many ways looking back to be alive. Now, it may not have felt it at the time. Right, many of us who are sufficiently elderly to remember the 1989 to 2004 period, not sure of my younger cousin in this room, but this period was a moment where there were many things that worried us, right? We worried about 9/11, we worried about the Iraq and Afghan wars, and this I'm about to get on to that in a second. We worried about many of the issues of inequality. We worried about Rwanda and Bosnia and Kosovo, but compared to today, in retrospect, this was a remarkably peaceful period. And then something changed. We entered a hinge period from 2004 to 2014. And this hinge period is really about the break between the connection of democracy and prosperity. The basic idea that was rooted for about 200 years that the richest countries in the world were democracies, and as you became richer, you'd want to live in a democracy. So your middle class grew, as your income increased, you'd want human rights, you'd want the vote. And this is broken, 2004, really with the rise of China. The Chinese economy at the end of our first period is smaller than the Italian economy. It's the 7th largest economy in the world. 2004 it becomes larger than the French economy, 2005 larger than the British economy, 2006 larger than the German economy, 2007 larger than the Japanese economy. If you look at a graph, the Chinese economy is going like this during this period. By 2014, it's become the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest exporter. It's carried us through the 2008 financial crisis almost single-handedly. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And it is building coal-powered stations at a rate of knots, and it is pumping carbon into the atmosphere. And it hasn't become a democracy. This period is also the period where our confidence in markets is broken by the 2008 financial crisis and all that that reveals. in terms of how markets work, how markets don't work, how Goldman Sachs gets bailed out 100 cents to the dollar when other people's mortgages go underwater. This is a moment where we become very, very aware of inequality of different sorts. Oh, and one of the strongest bits of inequality we become very aware of is regional inequality, within Britain, between London, the southeast and the northeast, for example. But there are equivalents in many other countries. The third thing that happens in this period is that our confidence in the rules-based international order is broken by the catastrophes of Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the candid intervention in Libya. This is the 10-year period where the US and its allies spend over $3.5 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. We invade Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban. We spend 20 years on the ground. We hand the whole country back to the Taliban again, and we achieve nothing. And finally, this is the period of the development of Twitter, Facebook, and the smartphone. The iPhone is launched in this period too. And the result of this is probably the most underrated event, I think, in the last 30 years, which is the Arab Spring, the Facebook revolution. This is an extraordinary moment because when it begins, we are still in that old optimistic mindset of the 90s and early 2000s. In fact, we're beginning to convince ourselves that we've got this amazing new technology and phones and social media, and it's going to be an incredible force for democracy and freedom of speech and liberty. And sure enough, when the whole thing begins, there are people gathering in Tahrir Square, and it feels like 1989 all over again. Whole of the Middle East is going to turn into liberal democracy. But what we find, driven by these devices, is that they change politics in three very, very dramatic ways, which again is going to become very relevant to your work on climate and the environment. Very, very relevant, particularly when you're talking about populism and climate denial. So what are these three ways in which they change things? Firstly, they change the world very much because they erode the difference between borders, between different countries, between different constitutions. Historically, if you were a bluffer like me teaching at Yale, right, you would give a description of a country which was based on stroking your chin and talking about its deep history. Well, France is like this because, Louis XIV had a centralized state, or the thing you need to understand about Italy is, it's a relatively modern country and this kind of stuff, right? What happens with the Arab Spring is that all these borders are wiped away. Somebody sets themselves alight in a small town in Tunisia, and within a few weeks we have revolution in Tunisia, and then in Libya, and then in Egypt, then in Syria, then in Lebanon, then in Bahrain, and then in Yemen. These are completely different countries with totally different histories, constitutions, sectarian setups, but they're all pushing in the same direction in a matter of weeks. Second thing, politics becomes literally chaotic in the same sense that weather is chaotic. We begin to see the political equivalent of the butterfly flapping its wings and things happening thousands of miles away. So in this case, someone sets themselves alight in a small town in Tunisia. The conflict spills over into Libya. As the conflict spills over into Libya and we respond, armed men from the Sahel who've been brought in by Gaddafi to try to prop up his regime are then pushed south. And as they get pushed south, the Wagner Group, an Russian mercenary group, settles in Libya and begins setting up an airbase. And this then deliberately and directly contributes to a string of coups d'etats that then stretch across the whole of Africa. So we then see coups d'etats happening in Guinea, in Gabon, in Niger, in Chad, in Mali, and in Sudan. And in every case, a total change from an elected government to a military dictatorship, sparked indirectly by somebody setting themselves alight in a town in Tunisia. But also in another direction, someone sets themselves alight in a small town in Tunisia, and then there's a war in Syria. War in Syria, 3 million people are pushed north into Turkey, out of Syria. 1 million of those people are then pushed from Syria across the Mediterranean into Europe, and now we have the rise of anti-immigration populist movements in Europe. And so the AfD getting 30% of the vote in Eastern Germany, Geert Wilders getting the most votes in the Netherlands, the populists in Austria, indeed potentially the Brexit referendum and the rise of Nigel Farage, owes a great deal to someone setting themselves alight in a small town in Tunisia and the way in which our phones transmit this information very rapidly across borders. And then the final thing that happens with social media is that the algorithms totally transform the way that we relate to each other. And what it does is it turns the graph of public opinion, which in the first period, 1989 to 2004, is a bell jar, so the votes are where my fingers are, not where my elbows are, right? First period is the third way, centrist politics, centrist dads, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, these kind of people, right? Suddenly, thanks to social media, the graph of public opinion becomes a U-shape. Suddenly now the votes are where my left elbow is, not where my left hand is. People are being pushed to left and right, and the centre is basically evacuated. Nobody's left in the centre. And this then brings us to the last 10 years, because what we see in the last 10 years is that all these seeds that have been sown begin to be reaped. So we see from 2014, the election of Narendra Modi in India, so a Hindu nationalist, replaces 20 years of coalition government. 2014, Vladimir Putin invades Crimea. 2015, the Law and Justice Party is elected in Poland. 2016 is the Brexit referendum in the UK. 2018, Bolsonaro is elected in Brazil. And of course, 2016 is the first election of Donald Trump. But it's not until the second election of Donald Trump that everything becomes full circle. Because by the time Trump comes back in 2025, we have moved from a first period, which was defined by liberal democracy, to a period now defined by populism and authoritarianism. From a first period defined by globalization and free trade, to a period now defined by protectionism and tariffs. From a first period, which was all about a rules-based international order, liberal intervention, international development, to a world of extreme isolation and breaking of the rules-based international order. And move from a world which initially, actually, if we look back at that world from 1989 to 2004, the world before Twitter, the world before Facebook, the world before the iPhone, it's a world where 92% of people are still receiving their news from very mainstream channels. In the United States, from 4 television networks, from newspapers with enormous readerships generating $55 billion of revenue a year. We're sitting, watching the evening news, in the US being told what to think by Walter Cronkite, in Britain by various people called Dimbleby, right, all reinforcing this bell jar with the votes in centre ground. Now, of course, in the 2025 universe, we are in the universe of TikTok, of X, Elon Musk's X, and of course the development of AI. Now, to wrap up and set up the next speakers, this means that you are no longer able to operate either as philanthropists or concerned citizens or as charities in a stable, predictable, rules-based international system. Right? This is no longer a world where you can cheerfully turn up at the G20 and sit down with the 20 largest economies in the world and try to come up with a common agreement on climate emissions, because it turns out that not only has Donald Trump not turned up to the G20, but he's instructed every single American official not to turn up at the G20. It is, in fact, now the G19, right? Again, you can hardly expect to be driving things through a UN process where we're now in a world in which the International Criminal Court faces direct sanctions from the US government, and which advisors to the International Criminal Court now risk having their assets stripped, and where the Secretary General of the United Nations has been declared persona non grata by a democratic state. Right? Nor is it going to be possible to do what would have been true if you were talking to me in 2019? In 2019, as the Secretary of State in DFID, I had an entirely unrestricted, uncontrolled budget of $20 billion a year. And nobody could touch it. There was an International Development Act in Parliament that defined what this money could be used for. It could basically only be used abroad for poverty, and later I inserted climate and the environment. I doubled our spend on climate and the environment. And no other department could touch it. The Treasury couldn't get anywhere near it. My colleagues couldn't get anywhere near it. It enraged them, right? But I had full control over this money. Right? Fast forward to today, instead of paying 0.7% on international aid, the Labour government has broken its manifesto commitment to restore that spend. It's actually reduced it to 0.3%, less than half. And of that, an enormous amount of that is being spent on asylum hotels in Britain and on Ukrainian refugees. So that the actual amount of money available from the British government to do things internationally is perhaps 10% what it was in terms of flexible spend. Meanwhile, the US Agency for International Development, which with the British government was the other largest international development donor in the world, $40 billion a year, supporting most of the major UN agencies, no longer exists. In contravention of Congress and US law, Trump has abolished the agency entirely. And similar things actually are happening without us seeing it in the Netherlands and Sweden, all of whom are falling back. Meanwhile, the populist far right isn't just energized by immigration, they are extremely energized by climate denial, something that is immensely exciting to them. Right? It's something that links, in a very weird coalition, the AfD in Germany right the way through to Trump. In fact, the three themes that seem to excite them at the moment are anti-immigration, pro-Russia, and climate denial, or human role in climate change denial. And in the United Kingdom, it's not just that reform has now moved against the government's targets. The Conservative government who introduced the targets, I mean, I voted for those targets, we passed them when I was in the government, has now come out saying that the targets that we implemented were entirely unrealistic. And Claire Coutinho, the Energy Secretary, who championed these things a year and a half ago, is now saying that they make no sense at all and that they will cripple British industrial life and make it impossible to grow the economy. Now, this means, and I'll finish on this, that there is a moment of opportunity, right? What I've described to you can sound like you all got to give up and go home. But actually, in a sense, the reverse, right? When there are boring people like me plodding around with $20 billion to international conferences, and everybody generally agrees, and all the politics is in the center ground, and we're all schnuffling around from COP conferences in Paris to the UN General Assembly. Actually, in some ways, the roles of charities, of NGOs, of lobby organizations can become more marginal. In the good old days, they were often working with us, supporting us. In fact, many of them former civil servants or coming in and out of the government in different directions. And we'd all sort of gently mouth nice platitudes at each other. Here, today, the value added provided by these organizations is much, much higher, because they are now charting an extremely important, lonely course, calling for urgent, courageous, evidence-based action in the context of a government that at the very best has lost direction and lost will, and a public that's beginning to lose conviction and energy. And yet, the science evidence hasn't changed at all. If anything, the profound, horrifying impact of the climate catastrophe is becoming more and more evident to us day to day. And the gap between the problem that we see and the nature of our response has never been wider. Which is why we are incredibly grateful that you're all here today, and which is why I hope that you continue to be as loving and as generous and compassionate as you have been and will continue to be in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Wow. Oh, I might use this mic. That was Rory's a hard act to follow. But you've all got a card saying our planet is at a tipping point. So I'm Tim Lenton. I'm going to speak for a little bit about unpacking that message. I mean, Rory just introduced the idea of a tipping point. He talked about that person in the market in Tunisia who set themselves on fire, and that very small change caused a massive difference. That's the central idea behind the tipping point. I often invite my audience at this point to lean back on the chair that you're sat on if you don't remember the idea that there's a balance point where a small nudge one way or the other can make a big difference to your fate. As change becomes self-propelling, sometimes in the wrong direction. But I was going to talk a little bit about, bad tipping points in the climate first, but then try and cheer you up and talk about positive tipping points and how the change we need can become self-propelling, and we can all play a part in that. I'm Tim, I'm a professor of these things. A little bit more subtle than the example of leaning back on a chair. Here I've got a little toy model of a system. It's in this state on the left, the ball rolling around in the valley, but there's another state this system could be in. And I'm forcing the system in a way that's making that initial state less and less stable, less resilient, we say, and some amplifiers that go to work within the system are getting stronger and stronger until we're going to reach a tipping point where they're strong enough to create a self-propelling change from one state to another. So that's the essence of a tipping point, as I'll talk about them briefly in the climate, in nature, but also in the changes we need in our societies. So we come to the room in a world whose collective political commitments are still going to take us to about 2.5 or 3 degrees centigrade of global warming later this century, which in simple terms is game over from where I'm standing as a professional on the subject. And I'll be emphasising we should collectively be doing everything in our power. Even though we're going to cross 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming, we should be doing everything in our power to minimise that overshoot, as we call it, and get back to cooler conditions in the future. Because we stand here in a world that's already 1.4 degrees centigrade above what we call the pre-industrial level. And I have to report we've crossed the first big tipping point in nature and the climate, which, as we've seen in the last 2 years of unprecedented heat waves in the ocean, the widespread dieback of over 80% of the world's coral reefs. A beautiful ecosystem that harbours around at least 1/4 of marine species, but also supports the livelihoods of around 500 million people and provides ecosystem services, as they're globally called, that have been valued at $3 trillion per year. And that includes profound coastal protection for communities living behind these reefs, which protect them from storm surges in a world of rising seas. So me and 160 colleagues have been recently released our latest Global Tipping Points report, also updating that as we stampede, I was going to say, over 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, which will be around 2030, we go into a danger zone where we're risking other critical tipping points in our life support system. They're loosely summarised here. I doubt you can read it unless you've been to Specsavers. But as well as the coral reefs already tipping, we're seeing, for example, the profound risk to the Amazon rainforest, another extraordinary home of biodiversity for sure. But the combined effects of people continuing to deforest the Amazon and climate change causing drying, droughts, fires, these together threaten a tipping point where the forest would tip into a very degraded, or we say savanna-like state, a very different ecosystem. That would directly harm 100 million people at least. It would severely impact the crop growing areas of Brazil and thus the Brazilian economy. It would release carbon to the atmosphere and take away cloud cover that added to global warming. So we'd all know about it. It would add to the problem. And then we live here in, you know where we live, in northwest Europe. And we enjoy mild winters despite the chilly conditions outside because of this thing, the Gulf Stream, which is part of a bigger thing, which we call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, bit of a mouthful, so then we call it the AMOC for short. But it's the red to blue loop here. Red is surface water going north and blue is cold, salty water heading back south, thousands of metres down in the Atlantic. And we know that great circulation can be tipped off. It can collapse. and it's at risk already. The thing that drives it is that waters get dense enough to sink from the top of the ocean to the bottom either side of Greenland. But at the moment, we're warming up the Arctic at an unprecedented rate. Fresh water is pouring off the Greenland ice sheet. These factors are making those surface waters less dense and less prone to sinking, and this overall circulation is slowing down. It's tipped off and back on again 25 times without human activities during the last ice age. But if it tips off, and it's at increasing risk of doing so, then these graphs are trying to convey what it does to the climate in a state-of-the-art climate model, a 2 degrees C warmer world. Suddenly on the right, the Arctic sea ice makes a remarkable comeback, and by February is down to the wash at its maximum extent. So we have a winter in London, once a decade we get a winter which is 3 fully frozen months of the year and minus 20 degrees centigrade, and in Edinburgh minus 30 degrees centigrade and frozen for 5.5 months of the year. And the summers will still be hotter than today because this is a 2 degree warmer world. So the seasonality of our climate would be like nothing we've used to have witnessed, and you can all make your own minds up about how our infrastructure and everything else will cope. It's a bigger picture problem than that, I have to warn you. The monsoons in West Africa and India could collapse, and that would be a humanitarian catastrophe, let alone the impacts on nature. And all of this, tragically, or it used to be beautifully, is coupled together because we're living in an interconnected Earth system, we call it, our life support system. And unfortunately, tipping one bit of that system, a bit like the human body, can make it more likely to tip another bit, and so on. So that's the biggest risk we need to be trying to avoid. We don't want to tip a negative cascade where the changes become out of our control. Which is why I come here from the COP30 that we heard about, and actually the message is pretty simple. The window for preventing these kind of devastating outcomes is rapidly closing. We need to be radically accelerating action to zero emissions and to stopping the destruction of nature and actually to regenerating nature to minimise what we'd call the overshoot of 1.5 degrees centigrade and get back onto safer territory or ground. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're not working fast enough. I think we probably all know that in our heart, if not in the data. In fact, we're going more than 5 times too slowly at what we call decarbonising the economy, which is why I've written a book about and will eulogise about the fact that there are also positive tipping points where the change we need itself becomes self-propelling. And that's exactly what we need. We need to accelerate out of trouble. And we need to be taking the actions we can to join in with the amplifiers that can propel us to a better state. So conceptually, it's quite simple. It's like my movie, but I simplified a bit further. We're in an unsustainable state of society, powered by, with plenty of what I call damping feedbacks maintaining the status quo. I mean, our government still subsidises the extraction of, and many governments subsidise the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. But we can all certainly picture a sustainable state, a renewable powered, electrified economy where people eat a little bit less red meat and there's space left to regenerate nature and so on. The crux of it though is that some actions can shift the balance of what we call feedback in the system in a way that does destabilise the status quo, does lower the hilltop, and ultimately can tip change of important systems from one state to another. I'll give you the British example, to be parochial, one of my favourites. This is a graph of power generation, electricity generation in the UK. The black line is coal power, and the green, blue and yellow are new renewables. The peak here is coal giving us 40% of our electricity in 2012. But wow, it tipped and it fell off a cliff. That was just because a modest price on carbon emissions was put into the power sector with the promise that it would only ever be stepped up over time. It's called a floor price on carbon. That was enough to turn the economics of coal burning bad, and investors start pulling their money out, and then that makes it even less profitable, so even more people pull out, and so on and so on. And then utility companies are left with power stations doing nothing that's very expensive. They destroy them, and you have an irreversible tipping point. And that 40% of power supply we got from coal, we're getting it now and more from new renewables today. Great. So in our work on tipping points on the positive side, we've been busy mapping out all the different sectors and activities that need to transform to zero emissions and to to reversing the decline of nature. The power sector alone, that's globally 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a big deal to switch to renewables. That's a quarter of the problem right there. Different sectors are at different points, different markets are at different points, but we see lots of other examples now of positive tipping. That the Asian markets, including China, are tipping to electric vehicles. In India, over half of the new rickshaws are electric powered. There's a similar two-wheel electric vehicle revolution happening in Africa, as well as a solar electricity revolution spreading around the world. And then there's nature. Well, where are we? Are we stopping the destruction of nature? Are there some good news stories about positively tipping to regenerating nature? Well, it's probably further back for nature positive farming, as I put it on here, but the potential is there. We're going to put it honestly, we're going to need some tipping point in our dietary trends worldwide towards eating less of the most damaging forms of meat consumption. That's beef, grazing fed beef, followed by lamb. But in the UK, we're already doing that. We are actually measurably reducing red meat consumption. That's the only way we're going to create space to regenerate nature and stop destroying it. But we are starting to generate that space. And I started off with coral reefs and the bad news. But there is some good news, for example, in locally managed marine protected areas that are often for coral reef communities. Community-led initiatives to protect these areas, protect their fisheries, regenerate those fisheries and the livelihoods of the people there have spread like wildfire. In this case, I'm just showing the data from some Pacific islands because I had good data for it. They spread most spectacularly in Fiji because the empowerment was with the people, with the communities that drove these initiatives. They may not have spread quite as successfully in Samoa, but there's a simple lesson there. That's because the government sort of incentivized it, but then they withdrew the incentives and surprise, the people stopped adopting. Well, this is just a somewhat regional example, but I can tell you that initiatives like this do show a tipping point where good initiatives will start to spread like wildfire from community to community. So yeah, my message is quite simple, and we're going to unpack it with a little panel in a minute. We all have some skin in the game, that's clear. We all have some agency to be part of the change we need, even if it's just as consumers. But often in the work that we do, we can also all play some part in trying to weaken those damping or negative feedbacks that maintain the old status quo, work with the amplifying feedbacks that create the change we need. To put it simply, every person who adopts, say, an electric vehicle helps make it cheaper, better and more accessible, that technology, and therefore more attractive for the next person to adopt. It's in that way that we've seen some markets, some sectors tip already, and we need to that to happen across the board. So my message is kind of stark on the one side and hopefully optimistic on the other. We've got to move from a situation that Rory spelt out rather eloquently of heading towards catastrophe in the climate and more besides, to one of a different but exciting kind of prosperity. The only way we're going to control the risks from what I call the climate tipping points is if we can accelerate to zero emissions, limit that overshoot of 1.5 degrees C. That certainly demands immediate action. But the message is we can all be part of that action. Rory spelled out beautifully how the rules have changed, but actually it's empowering for bottom-up actors. We have, as he put it, we have a stronger role to play now to come together, to amplify each other's actions, to start the change we need. And actually history teaches, whenever you've had truly profound social change, think of it, the end of the slave trade, votes for women, women's suffrage, pick foot binding in China, pick any of those examples. It starts with a small group of social activists. So thanks for listening to me, and now we're going to change gear a little. And I'm going to invite a couple of wonderful other guests, Laura and Claire, to join me. And we were going to quiz you because we're supposed to sit down, but we have a feeling you won't be able to see us for the panel discussion if we sit down. So would you prefer that we stand up? Because we can stand. Okay, there's a thumbs up at the back.
This is sitting down.
Claire is sat down. We'll all sit down.
And this is standing up.
Sat down, or would you rather stand up? You want to sit up?
Stand up.
Come on, good
Great.
stuff. So I've done my bit. I've looked at where the tipping points are. But now we want to turn to the solutions and hear a bit more about all of those. So I'm joined by Clare Brook from Blue Marine Foundation, Laura Clarke, who's from ClientEarth, and those are two amazing organisations who are really at the forefront, well, those of ocean protection and environmental law. And here, we're here today aiming to raise funds for these wonderful charities and for four other really high impact organisations. So I'm going to start maybe with Clare and then we'll go to Laura just to talk briefly about your organisation and some of the drive behind its mission and what you do.
Thanks, Tim. Well, astonishingly brilliant and thought-provoking speeches from both of you. And on this whole issue around the terrifying amount of emissions in the atmosphere and what we're going to do, what we can try and do to minimise the runaway climate crisis that we're on the brink of. One piece of fairly good news that I can bring to the room is that the ocean is the world's largest carbon sink. It holds 50 times more carbon dioxide than the atmosphere. It regulates the Earth's temperature by about 36 degrees, I think. And so it performs a wonderful role of absorbing about anything from 30 to 40% of our carbon emissions. But it can only perform this vital function by dint of the life within it. And in an act of incredible collective stupidity, we are engaged in draining the oceans of life through destructive overfishing and a few other threats to the ocean, but mostly through that. So Blue Marine's mission is a simple one. We are aiming to see at least 30% of the world's oceans placed under meaningful protection and the whole of the ocean sustainably managed. So we're trying to put an end to the most idiotic and wasteful examples of destructive overfishing.
Fantastic. Laura, I'm a big fan of ClientEarth, but can you tell us a bit more about the organisation and its mission?
Thank you. So ClientEarth, does what it says on the tin. The Earth is our client. So we are a legal environmental non-profit with 300 people globally, and we use the law in different ways to accelerate the change we need to protect the climate and nature, and also to protect human health and justice. And actually the law used in the right place at the right time can get us to those positive tipping points more quickly, and we use the law in a whole lot of different ways. So we try and get the right laws in place through advocacy, because if you get the right laws in place, you change the rules of the game. We use strategic litigation against governments. We sue governments, we sue big corporates for doing the wrong thing. And again, that's, going back to Tim's amazing presentation, that can help take down the old, tackle the vested interests of the status quo, and create the conditions for the new to come through. So strategic litigation is an amazing tool in shifting mindsets and behaviours, setting precedent. And then the third thing we do is we do what I call building the field. So we train people in environmental law, we work with community groups, indigenous peoples, because the more people there are globally who are using the law to defend the environment, to uphold their rights, the better, and the better chance we have of creating that change that we need.
Fantastic. Well, and I'd written down we've covered some of the more challenging aspects of the climate crisis today, although I think I've covered them. But the three of us all would love to say something about the good news. And there are some recent successes. So I wanted to ask each of you in turn what those are and what gives you confidence about the direction we're heading. So I'm going to start with Clare again. Maybe we're going to talk about would it be the High Seas Treaty?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of amazing good news this year. At Blue Marine, were it not for these sort of notching up of good news pieces, I think we, like the rest of us, would find the world an incredibly depressing and sort of worrying place at the moment. But in spite of everything that Rory was explaining about this sort of things falling apart from the centre ground, we have still seen some amazing examples of international cooperation in the world of ocean conservation, notably the High Seas Treaty, which has been years in the making with lots and lots of organisations involved and lots of countries involved. But in September this year, 60 countries ratified the High Seas Treaty, which means that that law will come into force on the 17th of January next year. And that means that for the first time ever, so the high seas covers 2/3 of the world ocean. That's about half the planet's surface, areas beyond any national jurisdiction. So very hard to get any sort of meaningful legislation as to how they're governed. At the moment, they're basically a free-for-all for longliners and purse seiners and fish aggregating devices. But thanks to this ratification of the treaty, it will become possible to have meaningful protection on the high seas. So that's a big example. I'll go down, I just want to show a picture, sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
I've got a couple of pictures here. These are two of my colleagues nobbling Rachel Reeves at the Labour Party conference. The two other colleagues successfully managing to sue the European Commission over the use of unlawful fish aggregating devices in the Indian Ocean. So my colleague Angela, with the Greek Prime Minister, and Kostas, the fisheries minister from the EU, saying that the model that we've helped to support in Amorgos in Greece, whereby fishers stop fishing for 2 months of the year and instead gather plastic litter out of the ocean, should be a model for the entire Mediterranean, which is very encouraging. And this is my colleague Fiona with the Prime Minister of Curacao, committing to protect 30% of their waters. Now, those of you who are football followers know that Curacao has just become the smallest country to qualify for the World Cup. Yeah. But even very small countries can sometimes have large bits of ocean. And the bit of ocean that he's talking about protecting is half the size of Wales. So you can imagine how many creatures are, potentially going to recover as a result of that. So the good news does keep notching up in the ocean space.
Fantastic. Oh, well, let's turn to you.
Another bit of good news. So, I would agree that, in this year where everyone's saying multilateralism is under strain, no one's really cooperating internationally anymore, the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions is absolutely a shot in the arm for multilateralism. Another bit of good news that's happened at the international level this year is an initiative that started in a classroom in Fiji, from some students in a university in Fiji, and went all the way to the ICJ, to the International Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the world. And what the ask was, that the students asked, and then it got built, they're supported by countries, Vanuatu, but other countries around the world, was to ask the highest court of the land, what are the obligations on states to tackle climate change? And in July this year, these judges, incredibly erudite judges, came out with a very, very forward-leaning opinion, a unanimous opinion, setting out very clearly that under international law, states have an obligation to make every effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, that they have a duty to cooperate internationally. Importantly, that if they don't regulate the conduct of private actors, so businesses, banks, investors, that could also constitute an internationally wrongful act. So if they subsidize fossil fuels, for example, if they permit new fossil fuel extraction, and they said that a healthy environment is a precondition for the enjoyment of human rights. So that's hugely important. It's an authoritative statement of what the law demands internationally in terms of climate action.
Incredibly powerful, yeah. Let's turn back to you, Claire, because Blue Marine Foundation, you've just been invited this year to advise 12 governments, is it? Maybe you could say a bit more about that and what the momentum or the challenges are that you see in trying to help countries protect their marine ecosystems.
Yeah, so I spoke before about this aim that we have of trying to get 30% of the world's oceans under some sort of meaningful protection. So in December 2022, another good piece of international cooperation was the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was signed by 196 countries around the world. You could guess which ones didn't. And so far of those 196, only I think 13 have protected more than 30% of their exclusive economic zones, but a lot more are making really good progress towards that figure. So what we try and do as Blue Marine is wherever we are invited and we feel that we can make a meaningful contribution, we go to those governments and advise them on how, first of all, scientifically, where they can best place their marine protection, potentially talk to them about sort of education and outreach, and but above all, what we're usually asked about is economics. So we try and point out to them, first of all, the incredible paucity of economics of overfishing. You know, it's a complete disaster. You're basically kind of depleting your own asset. So you're destroying livelihoods, you're destroying the future of your livelihoods. Often fisheries are subsidised, so it's actually kind of negative on the government's balance sheet. By contrast, if you have well-placed marine protected areas, you can create these kind of fish banks which regenerate marine life, which is good for fishing, is very good for tourism. But these marine protected areas, you know, the sort of leap into having them needs to be paid for. So we try and develop the economic models that'll help to do that. And that can be anything from establishing an endowment fund to sometimes looking at charging for use from people like cruise ship passengers, which is a model that we hope to break into because there's a lot of them, you can imagine. So going back to Curacao, for example, their whole marine protected area could be paid for by charging each cruise ship passenger that visits that place $1 per visit.
Wow. So turning back to Laura now, Rory was speaking eloquently about the political turbulence, these new and challenging times. So I get to ask you, how do you see politics shaping the climate fight, but crucially, how's the law helping maybe cut through some of the challenges or empower the change we need?
Yeah, and I think Rory's point, as he was saying, that actually at a time when government action is less certain and business action, let's face it, is less certain, then the role that the civil society has to play, the non-profit sector has to play is really important, and the role of the law is critically important, because law can provide, if you get a law in place, that bakes in a certain long-term thinking that is insulated somewhat from political turbulence. So if you think about the UK's Climate Change Act, it takes that emissions reduction planning out of the day-to-day of politics. And we have seen under that Climate Change Act, the UK has reduced emissions by 50%. The net zero economy last year grew 10% compared with, 1 point something percent of the rest of the economy. So the law is that amazing way of sort of, insulating from those sort of the political turbulence. The second thing I'd say is the law can be incredibly empowering. And I think one of our challenges right now with polarization is that there's this sort of sense that it's somehow political to want climate action. Well, it's not political to want to breathe clean air or live, or to have your children live in a safe and stable climate. And what we've been doing is working with community groups to really ensure that more and more people are using the law to defend the environment. Because of course, the impacts are all deeply personal. It's extreme heat, it's extreme weather, it's loss of livelihoods, but people can also drive the change, whether that's communities fighting for clean air legislation, whether it's women suffering pregnancy loss due to extreme heat, whether it's people suffering from plastic pollution, or it's small sustainable fisheries being put out of business by industrial fishing. The more we can get people to get their arms around it and have a stake in it, the better, because this has to be a transition that is owned from the bottom up, from people who have initiatives. Energy communities is another example. People who really have a stake in how their life needs to play out and can help drive the change.
Brilliant. And both of you and I know that a lot of this work, from the scientific groundwork through to the diplomacy, the litigation work, the practical work with communities. It's all difficult to fund through the traditional channels, and that organisations like both of yours do rely on philanthropy. So reminding the audience, you've got that little card you unfolded earlier. Maybe I'll start with Claire again. I'll ask you, how does support from the Global Returns Project enable you to achieve the impact at scale that you've been talking about?
Well, I think Rory put it beautifully, actually, that, in these very worrying times, it's really important to kind of regather in the centre ground and to misquote Edmund Burke, who I think didn't say this, but evil triumphs when good people do nothing, and good men do nothing. I think Laura and I will hold the women end up as well. But I think, therefore, philanthropic support enables the entire non-governmental community to keep giving governments the sort of backbone that they need and the vision that maybe they've lost. And then through systematic work, either through law or education or media or economics, to help to kind of prompt that change all the time. So your support is completely invaluable. I read something this morning that I thought I would just share with you. It's a short meditation, I suppose, about the state of the world. I found it rather moving. The writer, who's called Warson Shire, says, "Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, 'Where does it hurt?' It answered, 'Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere.'"
Poetically sobering. Yeah, fantastic. Laura, how does the Global Returns Project help your work with ClientEarth?
Helps hugely. So bringing legal cases is very expensive. The support that we get is amazing. In the past couple of years, we have sued the UK government over its inadequate net zero strategy and won and secured a much improved plan. We've tackled governments for allowing bottom trawling in marine protected areas. We've tackled authorities for not doing enough to protect communities from the pollution from industrial pig and poultry farming. We do so many cases that are holding governments to account. So of course we're not going to get government funding for that, but are also holding big corporates to account. We had we've sued the board of directors of Shell for not doing enough for managing climate risk. We're tackling Total Energies and KLM for their greenwashing work. All of this is so important. It is about bringing down the bad and the old and bringing up the new, getting to those tipping points. And all the work that we do is philanthropically funded, so it is incredibly important.
Yeah, and it's probably worth saying, Laura and I think we run our organisations in quite a similar way, in that we try to keep quite a lean base in our sort of head offices, and work as much as we can in partnerships. So, we've got 200 partners around the world.
We also work very much through partners. Yeah.
And so we're not trying to kind of hog the money in our headquarters. It's very much about trying to sort of share it around the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Building those networks and coalitions of the willing. I certainly couldn't write a Global Tipping Points report without 160 other researchers from 90-something countries.
It's a team sport.
Absolutely. So I've talked about the negative tipping points, and we've all talked a bit about the possibility of positive ones. So I wanted to make the last formal question: if you could trigger one positive tipping point in the next 5 years, what would it be? Let's stick with the order, Claire.
Well, I think that one tipping point has actually been seen this year, which I'd like to ask the room, actually, who here has seen the film Ocean with David Attenborough? Wonderful. Those of you who haven't, I do urge you to see it, because for me, this film is a bit of a game changer, because it has, first of all, brought to a wider audience than understood it before. But I think something like 4 million people have seen it around the world. The fact that the ocean is the world's most important ecosystem, that it plays this vital role in stabilizing our climate, but that we are destroying it through destructive overfishing. And there's this incredible, powerful footage in the film showing a bottom trawler going along the bottom of the ocean, and then the appalling scenes of the sort of waste of all this fish kind of gasping for life and just being sort of pushed dead over the edge of the boat. And this has caused a sort of mini revolution in the understanding of the ocean and its role, and in particular what we're doing sort of under the waves. I think people were very excited by plastic before, but it's increased people's understanding of the sort of destructive nature of certain types of fishing gear. And so my tipping point is that I'm calling peak bottom trawling. And I think, you know, we've seen already with the UK government and in the EU moves to start to get that practice, first of all, banned from marine protected areas, obviously, but I think we will see it more widely banned, and that will make a huge difference.
Brilliant. Laura, your favourite tipping point for the next
the thing that I think would make the biggest difference would be if we could get rid of environmentally harmful subsidies. Subsidies for fossil fuel, for destructive fishing practices, for destructive agriculture. Those subsidies amount to about 7 trillion a year. Think what you could do with that money for human health, for environmental gain, for education. I mean, it's extraordinary. And the extraordinary thing is that there's not more outrage about it, because this is money that's coming from taxpayers' pockets, and it's going to big oil to essentially burn fossil fuels and destroy the future for our children. So it is an outrage. What does that look like, shifting environmentally harmful subsidies? It's really tough, right? Because it's a really hard thing to shift because the fossil fuel lobby is still so strong. But what it takes is a global approach, global campaign in terms of advocacy, but also litigation, multiple bits of litigation around the world. And ClientEarth has started that. We won a case against France's common agricultural policy. We're challenging another state for its support for fossil fuel infrastructure. But those bits of litigation around the world, plus a campaign to mobilize people to say, do not let my taxpayer dollars, my taxpayer pounds, go into the destruction of our planet. That will be a critical tipping point, I think. And it's so important. And the way that that public money is used defies belief. And I saw a line recently that said, if the earth was a bank, we would have saved it by now. So we have to think about that, the way things work, and when we ought to be able to shift that. Thank you.
Hear, hear. I think I'd have backed exactly the same recommendation. And Rory, I thought, was spot on as well, reminding us of this kind of sea of misinformation we're increasingly swimming in. So none of you should be in any doubt about the huge net benefits of making this transition faster for the majority of the world. To give a simple statistic, over 3/4 of people live in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels, and many of those are many of the poorest countries in the world and the poorest people. So it's an immediate economic benefit to their balance of trade and the productivity of their economy to stop importing and generate what's already much cheaper renewable power in country. Well, we've rattled through it and we're bang on time, so I want you to give a very warm congratulatory thank you to the wonderful panel. And thank you, Lauren. Georgie, you're going to tell us that we migrate upstairs.
Yes.
Are we giving them on?
Sure. Thank you so much. What a powerful conversation to end on. I think our fireside chat has just made something very clear, that we do have the solutions. And so I'm going to highlight that it's all up to us. I've got 2 volunteers at the back who have some beautifully knitted baskets. And I'd like to encourage you to put your little pledge card in there, and then welcome everyone upstairs to a drinks reception. And our lovely panellists will also be up there, so please do ask any questions, and I just ask you to move on up. Thank you so much.